Jean, this dream's where you belong.
1953. He continues to travel the U.S. and Mexico. He writes Maggie Cassidy. He writes The Subterraneans. 1953 for him was not a year of any kind of closure. And all he looked for in 1953, and I don't understand why, he looked for closure. So he said, what the hell? 1954 is going to bring me something. Maybe closure. So, while in San Jose, California, he's sitting around at the library, taking in his usual reads, he discovers Dwight Goddard. And Dwight Goddard wrote a book called The Buddhist Bible. This makes his immersion into, this is actually the form which gives him his immersion into Buddhism. Before this, it was just a fanciful, wonderful idea. Now there's actually a way to be. Now, at the same time he's doing this, he begins to watch the McCarthy trials, or McCarthy hearings, excuse me. And he falls in love with Joe McCarthy. Now, the interesting thing about Jack Kerouac is he's not really a political guy. Never had been a political guy. And he's not quite sure what he's going to be getting out of this, but he's mesmerized. So, at this point in time, he finishes the selected readings and the selected letters. Begins to write Sum of Dharma. Begins to write San Francisco Blues, which was read by Dan, and the Book of Blues. And he said, in this period of time, he said, well, why was I looking for closure in 54? Now I have a new beginning and a new opening. And in 1955, he writes to him, one of his greatest works, the bio of Siddhartha Gautama, which is called Wake Up. Now in 55, he blossomed. He begins to write Tristessa, begins to write Mexico City Blues. He began the Book of Haikus. He writes Good Blonde and Others. He finishes some of the Dharmas. And during this whole period of 1955, he's still continuing to watch these hearings. And he realizes, shit, I am an enemy of both sides. The right wants to hang me for my sexual liberalism and my devout drug use. And the left hates me because I'm a fervent crusader for anti-communism. And on top of it, I'm a Catholic. So anyways, he finds himself continuously watching these hearings, smoking a little cannabis, drinking his malt beverage, and rooting for Joe McCarthy. And the quote that comes out of this is, Marxism is like Freudianism, to be an illusionary tangent. That's what it comes down to for him. And when he was a student at Columbia, you know, he thinks back when he was a student in Columbia, and he said, I hated this Marxist crap. Why did they have to teach me this? So, 1956, he finishes Tourista. He writes Visions of Girard, writes the Scripture of the Golden Eternity, and writes Old Angel Midnight. Now, 1957, an earmark year for him. On the Road was finally purchased by Viking Press, and this gave him the ability to actually buy some things that he liked, preferably bar tabs and women. So, July of 1957, he moves to 1418 and a half Cloister Avenue in College Park in Orlando, and awaits the release and the review by Gilbert Milstein of the New York Times. Now, I don't know if anybody's familiar with Gilbert Milstein, but at the time he was the leading literary critic. He is the man who developed the New York the New York Review of Books. So this is a big thing. So this is what was written. This was what was written by Milstein. He is the king of the Beat generation. Now you have to understand, Beat generation was not even written about. So this is where it first came into the American lexicon. And Gilbert placed him as the notorious, shameless, and generous new writer of America. That's insane for that time, where a new writer came right out of the box with such praises, especially by an old sap. So at this particular point in time, he becomes the leader, or the leader of the Beat generation. Now, you have to understand, Jack Kerouac couldn't stand, one, the term Beat generation, and two, being referred to as being a beat, or a beatnik. At this point in time, he meets Robert Frank, director and producer, and founder, essentially, of the improv and photojournalism motif in movies. He also meets Gary Schneider, T.D. Suzuki, and Ruth Fuller Sakis. And he returns to painting. Now, he's now taking on some interviews by leading magazine editors, Vanity Fair. Oh, I forgot to mention, back in his younger days, while he was a student at Columbia, he had found fascination with a woman by the name of Dorothy Parker. Now, as you know, she was a leader in her own right, and one of the founders of the Algonquin Round Table, the New Yorker magazine, and Vanity Fair. By this point in time in her career, while he was a student at Columbia, she was senior editor. And he went up and approached her. And as you know, she was not a very approachable woman, or not a very approachable person. And this quote was taken by Hugh Auchincloss. He just so happened to be in the elevator at the time with Dorothy Parker. And Jack just happened to be in that elevator. And Jack's a little nervous. And he says out loud, "I don't know who the hell this old lady is, but I got to meet her." And, of course, she turns around and says, "What old lady are you referring to?" And he says, "Well, I'm here to meet one of my critics." And she says, "Well, then, who the hell are you?" And he says, "Well, I'm Jack Kerouac." And she says, "Well, I'm Dorothy Parker." And she says, "I still don't know who you are, but you should at least know who I am." And I says, "Oh, absolutely." And he wasn't tongue-tied or dumbfounded. He got right on his toes, and he said, "Well, you wrote a really awful critique of some of my early stuff." And she says, "I still don't know who the hell you are, and does it really matter?" So that was the conversation that they had. And this was taken on by Hugh Auchincloss, who was a very dear friend of hers and Jackie Onassis' stepfather. Anyhow, back to 1957. He returns to New York on again, off again, briefly to hang out with Burroughs and Ginsberg and Corso. And a number of incidents occur, okay? Again, known for his brawling in bars, he continues to do that. Well, anyways, he goes to a bar out on Bleecker Street called the San Remo Bar. And 3 men badly beat him. And he winds up in the hospital, and he says, "This is it. It's got to be because of my celebrity that these assholes beat me." So, I did say assholes, because he said it. So, he begins his, this was kind of a turn for him, where he is no longer going to participate in life as a celebrity. So, during the same period of time out in California, Neil Cassidy, with his little bit of celebrity, has been routinely arrested and rearrested for marijuana possession. So, people kept on picking on these poor guys. And so anyways, in November, December of 57, he writes Dharma Bums. He begins to write Heaven and Other Poems. He writes Beat Generation, and he begins to letter and journal, which would become the second part of his selected letters. And he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do with these letters. But anyways, they were out there. And finally, in 1957, he's interviewed by Steve Allen. Everybody familiar with who Steve Allen is? Okay. On The Tonight Show. And the interview went so spectacularly well that he and Steve Allen became fast friends and stayed friends again until his death. Now, one of the interviews was an interview that was done at his home in Orlando, and he was showing off paintings. And a lot of his paintings were religious icons. Paintings of Jesus and the Virgin Mary and Saint so-and-so. Yeah, I don't know who these guys are. So anyways, there's one of his paintings, and it was a painting of Pope John the Sixth. I think that's how it works. And Steve says, well, what what are you? Are you truly part of this beat generation? And he says, Steve, no, I'm not a beatnik. I'm a Catholic. And you know who painted this fine piece of artwork? Me. And he was pointing to that painting of Pope John. Now, later on, these interviews are listed in Departed Angels and the Last Paintings. Anyhow, 1958 comes along. They publish Dharma Bums. He meets Alan Watts, and he moves into an even slipperier slope with more drugs and more alcohol and more dirty women. So, for him to stop this, he decides, hell, I got to move in with my mother. She needs my help anyways. So he moves to Northport, New York. One, to hide from his celebrity. Two, to take care of his mother, who seemed to always be ailing in his eyes, but she was healthy as an ox. And two, to get away from Alan Watts. So anyways, they published the Subterraneans, and at this point in time, he meets Alfred Leslie and Frank O'Hara. Now, Frank, at this particular point in time, was new to the scene and was curator of a small museum, and who would eventually become curator of a great museum, Museum of Modern Art. Anyways, 1959 comes along. They publish Dr. Sachs. Maggie Cassidy's published. Mexico City Blues is published. He films Pulling My Daisies, which is directed by Rob Frank and Alfred Leslie. Originally called, again, with this revision stuff, The Beat Generation. The problem is at the same time this was going on, MGM took that title and turned it into its own movie. Now, this pissed him off incredibly. One, because he hated the term beatnik and beat culture, and that's what they wanted to turn it into. And he didn't want to have anything to do with it. Now, remember, Jack wrote and narrated the whole movie. It was directed by Rob Frank and Alfred Leslie. He records Blues and Haikus with Al Cohn and Zoot Sims. He records Poetry for the Beat Generation with Steve Allen. And he writes Trip Trap, Haiku on the Road, from San Francisco to New York. This period of time, he was doing immense traveling. He was being interviewed. He had found himself on the pages of a majority of popular magazines. So he said, what the hell, I'm going to create my own zine. And so he did. And like Malcolm Johnson, They were ragtagged, stapled together, some on string, paper that he could get together. And he did it. Anyways, 1960 rolls along. He finishes and publishes The Book of Dreams. Lonesome Traveler, writes and publishes. Publishes The Scripture of the Golden Eternity. Compiled, at this particular point in time, poems of all sizes. And records readings by Jack Kerouac on the Beat Generation. Now, also finishes and publishes Visions of Cody, finishes and publishes The Book of Dreams, and I already have that one down. Okay. Now, at this point in time, am I moving around too much?
No.
Okay.
Yes, stand still.
At this point in time, CBS, Screen Gems, TV, General Motors, which at the point in time was selling Chevrolet product, and Sterling Silliphant wanted to put together a television show called Route 66, which was an exact copy of On the Road. So he said, well, wait a minute. This commercialization, once again, why am I fighting against it? So he decides to bring suit. So he sues CBS, Screen Gems TV, General Motors, and Sterling Silliphant. Now, I'm going to give you a little brief history on this. Columbia Broadcasting System, at this particular point in time, was owned and operated by William Paley, the TV mogul. His wife was a Jack Kerouac fan and a jazz enthusiast. Now, Columbia Broadcasting System's other company was the Tiffany Company. And William Xavier Tiffany, the great-grandson of William Comfort Tiffany, was a big fan of Jack Kerouac. And they weren't having any of this. They were willing to settle. But there were so many people in the suit that they couldn't. So, Screen Gems TV. Parent company was Columbia Pictures, now Sony, and was run by two brother-in-laws, George Winkler and Charles Mintz. And these guys were the guys who produced programs like the Three Stooges. Anyhow, they were willing to fight this fight. They had the money to do it, and they said, oh, what the hell? He's just a low-rent writer. Just to let you know, the actors, the three actors that were Stoogers, they didn't act. They actually came together and put their acting tools down and said, you can't do this. But they went on to do it anyways. So anyways, and last but not least, Sterling Silliphant is, of course, the founder of the great disaster films like The Towering Inferno and The Poseidon Adventure. And so anyways, that's 1960. 1961, remember, he had had a daughter 9 years ago with his ex-wife. And as I'd stated before, he didn't accept her. So anyways, finally, blood test came along, paternity was his, and he began to pay his child support. and he began to accept his daughter, who would eventually be very much like his father, like her father. He completed the Book of Blues and the Book of Haikus. 1962, he writes and publishes The Big Sur and finishes Heaven and Other Poems. Now, 1963 was the most inactive year of his life. He spent most of his time traveling from bar to bar, from city to city, just taking in exactly what Dan had mentioned, the sights, the sounds. He filled up the previous 2 years with so much of his time that he felt that he needed other people's time. He felt that he needed to experience other people just by sitting there and being him. So he promised himself that 62 and 63 were going to be those kinds of years. And the only thing that happened in that year of significance in the publishing end is that he gets The Vision of Gerard published. Now, in 1964, he felt would be a change year. Now, remember all of the political stuff that's going on at the time. He drops the suit against CBS, Gem Television, Chevrolet, and Silifant. And at the same time, his older sister dies of a heart attack. And this puts him into a Great Depression. They were very close. And he does completely nothing in 1964. What he considers nothing is what I had stated earlier, going to his favorite lounges and bars and drinks and fights and chases gals. He also goes back in 64, 65 to close up some family stuff. And he would eventually, at this point in time, meet his future wife. But in 1965, he finishes Desolation Angels, writes and finishes Satoni in Paris. And in 1965, he befriends the great William F. Buckley, Jr. And this is where he begins his constant television appearance on Firing Line. Now, the same time, he meets his most critical critic, which of course was the squeaky, as he called him, the squeaky short queer, which was Truman Capote. And Truman's quote about Jack Kerouac is, "This is not writing, it's typing." Ruthless. So in 1966, he marries Stella, and they arrive here in St. Petersburg. I forgot the address again. What is?
5027 Northeast or North 10th Avenue North.
Right. Now, during these periods of time, he joins the Firing Line team, and he and Bill Buckley, which is a very interesting mix, have an incredible working, critical relationship with each other. And they both have an immense amount of respect. So anyways, in 1968, this would be his last appearance on television. And this would be his last appearance on Firing Line. He essentially shows up visibly drunk and high. And he still outwits the five guys on the panel. Now, I brought for later perusal that interview, and I'll have it running at the picnic table. Anyways, he writes and publishes Vanity of Duluth and finishes Scattered Poems in 1968. Early in 1969, he finishes Pick, the novella, and about 6 or 7 weeks before he dies, he's in his last and final bar fight, which took place at the Flamingo here in St. Petersburg, and is immediately hospitalized and walks out. Says, "There's nothing wrong with me." Well, come to find out, he had a hernia. Anyways, I'm going to leave it at that. Come back and talk about his last year and stuff that occurred later. Anyone coming up for a...
Do we have a visitor reading?
No.
Okay. Well, then the hell with that idea.
You gonna read some here?
You're on.
Oh, yeah, I get one, yeah. I read one.
Not your poem.
Yeah.
Okay. Ian finishes his.
Just let me finish this 69. All right. Anyways, October 20th, 1969, around 11 a.m., sitting in his favorite chair, drinking whiskey and malt beer, writing notes for a new book about his father's print shop in Lowell, Mass. He falls sick to his stomach, which of course was not an unusual occurrence for him. So he goes to the bathroom and throws up, and it's a large amount of blood. And he yells to his wife, "Stella, I'm bleeding," and is immediately taken by ambulance to St. Anthony's Hospital here in St. Petersburg. And he continues to pour blood, and he dies the next morning, October 21st at 5:15 a.m. of internal hemorrhaging and cirrhosis of the liver. And that's that. That's his life. The interesting thing is the reason why I'm interested in him is not for what he wrote or how he wrote it. It was that he affected an immense amount of people. And he affected writing style. As Peter mentioned earlier, he opened up a whole new world to a whole new generation of people, or generations of people. And that not only included the written word, but the spoken word, jazz, and what today is called hip-hop. He brought a subculture into majority culture. And he took along the African American community with him in this whole process. Now, there are a number of people who considered him their inspiration for what they did. And I'm going to give you a couple of people. And that would be Jim Morrison, Tom Waits, Bob Dylan, Ken Kesey, Richard Brannigan, Tom Robbins, Lester Baggs, Dan Stevens, Art Art Garfunkel, the Beatles, just the whole process. Now, in 1974, Allen Ginsberg and Ann Waldman, through their connection with the Buddhist University in Boulder, Colorado, put together a school called the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. And this continues on today. And you get MFAs and so on and so forth. But there are so many things that he affected, both in style and in art, that we cannot forget him. And he lived right here in our wonderful city. That's that.
Tijan, this dream's where you